What's going on, everyone? My name is Jasmine. On today's episode of The Slain Project, we're going to be talking about the missing and murdered of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And I did a video on this before, and I talked about alcohol, drugs, and trafficking along I-90. And in this video, I'm going to talk about historical events and how they affect life on the reservation, and also about a pedophile doctor who was allowed to work on the reservation for over 20 years. And I'm going to mention residential schools, the massacre at Wounded Knee, and the turmoil of the 1970s. And I'm not going to go into great detail because I covered those in my Highway of Tears video and my Cody White Pipe video. And if you would like to see more videos on missing and murdered Indigenous people, click that subscribe button and the notification bell. Now let's get right into it. We often do not think of people being fragile until they are sick or until they die. The Lakota are a very strong and proud people who take pride in their culture and lineage. They have survived the worst of the tragic events that were part of the Western expansion in the settling of the United States. The Great Sioux Nation once spanned hundreds of miles across the Great Plains in North America. The Sioux Nation consists of Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota. The Lakota are then split into 7 sub-bands. Some Sioux tribes migrated into Canada before European contact, and some tribes sought out refuge there during the Sioux Wars in the United States during the years 1851 to 1890. In present day, there are about 3 dozen Sioux tribes throughout the U.S., Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The Fort Laramie Treaty was signed by the U.S. government and the Plains tribes in 1851. Its purpose was to maintain peace among the warring tribes, allowing the government to build roads and outposts in the area to help aid white settlers along the Oregon Trail. Among the promises in the treaty, the tribes were given a yearly monetary payment. It also allotted the Black Hills to the Sioux, but this treaty was violated by the government when gold was discovered there. Only 1 yearly payment was ever made, and the never-ending need for land pushed the tribes to engage their enemies. The treaty was redone in 1868, and the pursuit of a peaceful existence never really came into existence. The Black Hills were seized by the government in 1877, and they eventually carved Mount Rushmore into the lands that were considered sacred by the Sioux. The Black Hills are held in a high regard among the Sioux, and they have a rich green forest, unlike the barren land of the current-day Pine Ridge Reservation. The gold that has been mined from the Black Hills since 1877 easily totals into the billions, but the Lakota living on the reservation live in third-world country conditions. In 1980, the Supreme Court would find that the U.S. violated the Fort Laramie Treaty by wrongfully seizing the Black Hills and awarded the Sioux tribes of the region a $102 million compensation. The tribes never collected the money, which is estimated to be about $1.3 billion in today's money. They would prefer to have the Black Hills returned to them and never collected the cash because they say the land was never for sale. The Sioux fought to save their livelihood and way of life during the Sioux Wars. It also introduced the world to some of the fiercest warriors to ever grace the battlefield. The Sioux's greatest victory was when they won the Battle of Little Bighorn and defeated General Custer on June 26, 1876. Some believe that this victory led to the retaliation killings at the Wounded Knee Massacre on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The massacre was inflicted by the 7th Cavalry on December 26, 1890. This is the same cavalry General Custer belonged to. This was the last major engagement between the U.S. government and the natives. A year before, in 1889, is when the Pine Ridge Reservation was being established. Assimilation began, and the Lakota were forced to depend on government for food rations. The tribal youth were then targeted and sent to boarding schools. Boarding schools are more commonly known as residential schools in Canada. I will link a great documentary in the description box. It was released in November 2022 and is about Pine Ridge elders who have survived boarding schools. The mighty buffalo that once ruled the plains were also being slaughtered at an insane rate. They were almost killed into extinction. Some sources say that this was to harvest the hides for white settlers, but in reality, this was done to force the native population into food dependency, and the US government began distributing food to the Sioux tribes. The food rations that were distributed were very unhealthy for the native population. They were used to lean wild game, vegetables, and other wholesome food that came from the earth. And as a means for survival, the popular food item known as fry bread came into existence. And in present day, food rations are still being distributed by the USDA. They are known as a commodity supplemental food program. Many people on the res must travel a long distance to the closest grocery store for healthy food. Some cannot travel this distance because of no transportation. And it is a known fact that healthy food choices are far more expensive than less healthy food. So if you are poor, you're going to make your dollars stretch by purchasing less healthy food. You will be able to see a correlation between poverty, the government food program, and lack of access to healthy food and diabetes. Diabetes among natives is high, and most suffer more from harmful side effects of the disease because they do not have access to adequate health care. Their diets are harder for them to manage because their food budgets cannot afford the proper food for their condition. There are a lot of nice families on the reservation, but many problems plague the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, and this contributes to the missing and murdered indigenous people epidemic. Widespread problems such as alcoholism, drug use, overdoses, poverty, school dropout rates, high incarceration rates, suicides, and domestic violence are just a few of the current problems. And some of these are categorized as their own separate epidemics. Trauma and poverty can be seen as the gateway to these widespread problems that follow the native population in Pine Ridge, other reservations, and even the urban native populations. The Pine Ridge Reservation struggles with an unemployment rate of about 90%, and this is not by choice. Jobs are scarce on the reservation, and there is a large population, so there are not enough jobs to go around for everyone. Pine Ridge is the poorest reservation in the U.S. Homelessness is also a serious problem. There is a lack of affordable housing on the reservation. Multiple families will often stay in one home, and it is very common to have at least a dozen or more people in one home. This often leads to the home turning into a state of disrepair that affects the safety and well-being of the occupants. Most of us have heard of intergenerational trauma when it comes to the MMIW and MMIP epidemic. The hardships faced by a child's parents and their grandparents affect the way they raise their children, and the affected parents would often abuse alcohol and their children. These behaviors were learned by the children being raised by them, and they would often be the same way with their kids. This leads to a lot of families being stuck in a never-ending cycle of despair. In recent years, the scientific study of epigenetics suggests that historical trauma can be passed down to the children of an affected person. It suggests that harsh environmental changes and trauma will leave a marker on the DNA passed down and affect the way a person's new child reads the DNA passed down to them. Researchers have studied the children of Holocaust and POW survivors and found that most of them had the DNA marker that affects the way they respond to stress. They could suffer from depression, bipolar disorder, or become dependent on alcohol or drugs. There is also a slight increase in the mortality rate among the people with this marker versus people who do not have this marker embedded in their DNA. More research is still needed to understand historical trauma and epigenetics, and I would like to see this study conducted on indigenous people. This could be why there is a high alcoholic rate in the native population. They were only introduced to alcohol about 150 to 200 years ago, and it devastated the way they thought and cared for themselves. In contrast, the Europeans had been drinking alcohol for thousands of years. Throw in the trauma from boarding schools, the numerous battles fought by their ancestors, and the many who were slaughtered at the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, and the high number of murders on the reservation in the 1970s, when the AIM movement clashed with Dick Wilson's Goon Squad, and almost every family on the Pine Ridge Reservation was affected one way or another by violence. A search within the FBI website will come back with multiple sex offender files from numerous reservations in its database. The cases that go through the federal court system are listed on the site, and many involve young children. These children are essentially being destroyed before they even have a chance. And the Pine Ridge Reservation has a lot of serial offenders. Most offenders are tribal members, but one prominent case is that of Dr. Stanley Weber. He was a Caucasian pediatrician who worked for the Indian Health Service, also known as IHS, and he preferred young male patients. Early in his career, he was in Browning, Montana, on the Blackfeet Reservation in 1992. He liked to see his young male patients alone in exam rooms. One of his co-workers noticed at his home, Dr. Weber had a lot of candy, sodas, and video games in his basement. This alarmed them because it seemed as if he was luring the children to his basement. Many complaints over his conduct were made, and nothing was done until a parent confronted and assaulted him. After this, he was transferred to Pine Ridge. By this time, the year was 1995. It did not take long for Dr. Weber to begin his same cycle of abuse that he did in Browning. Complaints were made about his conduct, and he was put on clerical duties for a while as IHS investigated. Their investigation did not amount to anything, and he was allowed to resume his duties as a doctor. His actions with the young boys also continued. They ranged from age 10 to 13. Some were hired to work in the garden he had at his home, and some were given prescription drugs for performing favors on the doctor. He was taking advantage of these young kids who had nothing. They were just trying to survive in their impoverished world. One of his victims said that all the hospital staff would stare at him when he left Dr. Weber's exam room. A lot of people knew what was going on, and the boys who he exploited were known as the Weber boys around town. One of the boys was taking pills and drinking one night. He went to the doctor's house where he assaulted him and stole his wallet. The tribal cops were called, and the teenage boy broke down and told them everything the doctor had done to him. The tribal cops did not have the authority to arrest the doctor because he was not a tribal member. All they could do is forward the information to the BIA. They did so, but nobody ever followed up from the BIA. IHS kept saying the doctor had a clean record, but one of the other doctors at the Pine Ridge Hospital found out that he was ran out of Browning under the same suspicion that everyone in Pine Ridge had. More and more complaints were filed with the Indian Health Service. They finally initiated another investigation into Dr. Weber in 2009. IHS sent a man named Ron Keats to investigate the allegation that Dr. Weber was a pedophile. But Ron Keats would be arrested in 2010 for 4 counts of possession and trafficking of child porn. After Keats was arrested, the investigation into Dr. Weber ceased, and he was free to roam again. Just to summarize that, Dr. Weber was investigated by another pedophile. The investigator was arrested for possession inappropriate material involving children, and the investigation into Dr. Weber stopped, and IHS did not pursue the matter further. The doctor who made the complaints to IHS and pushed for the investigation was disciplined by his superiors and was transferred to another reservation 500 miles away along the Canadian border. It was revealed that Ron Keats had a computer disk that contained more than 1,000 images of children and videos of him touching himself in his work office. He had 3 of the charges dropped, pleaded guilty to 1, and received a prison sentence of 3 years and 8 months. Nothing would happen to Dr. Weber until 2015, when a new tribal prosecutor named Elaine Yellowhorse remembered the drama surrounding Dr. Weber and got together with the tribal attorney general to discuss going after him. It was very hard to get his male victims to talk. They were all adults by this time. They tracked one of them down in prison. It was the same person who went to Dr. Weber's house and assaulted him and stole his wallet. In May 2016, Dr. Weber was questioned again about his activities. Many of the hospital staff were afraid to speak up out of fear of losing their jobs. Eventually, Dr. Weber was charged with abusing 4 boys on the Pine Ridge Reservation and 2 boys on the Blackfeet Reservation. After being abused by the doctor, most of the boys lived very troubled lives and had problems with the law. Some became addicted to alcohol and drugs, ran with gangs, and some even ended up in prison. When these victims were put on the witness stand, they were in their 30s. Pictures of them were displayed at the same age as the abuse. These guys, who seemed like hardened criminals, crumbled like scared children on the stand. Their memories of the abuse followed and haunted them throughout their lives. Dr. Stanley Weber was convicted of sex abuse in Montana and received 18 years. For the cases in South Dakota, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences plus 45 years. This is to be served consecutive to the Montana sentence. Dr. Weber was 70 years old at the time he was sentenced. His work colleagues had been working to expose him for at least 15 years, but IHS looked the other way. Because of this, the U.S. government recently reached a settlement with 8 of Weber's known victims. Each victim is to be paid between $1.5 and $2 million. This money will not erase the trauma that happened to them, but hopefully Weber's conviction will help close this dark chapter in their lives so they could move on and heal. After understanding all the turmoil and violence that has occurred on the Pine Ridge Reservation, it is easier to understand the high suicide rates that have haunted the population for so long. Exposure to long-term trauma and violence has led to severe mental health issues. Many of the people who take their lives do so at a very young age, and there have been even more attempts and threats of suicide. There is no easy solution to fix these issues, but with more understanding and awareness, there can be some type of hope for a change in a positive direction. The following are missing and murdered cases from the Pine Ridge Reservation. If you want to hear more additional cases from this reservation, please go back and watch my first Pine Ridge video, also the video on Larissa Lonehill, Cody Whitepipe, and Juanita Adams. Andre Starr grew up in Oglala. He was raised by his Aunt Lisa Gibbons. He was a sun dancer, and his family described him as a very kind and caring person. Andre's birthday was October 20th, 2022, and he was turning 29 years old that day. His family texted his phone, messaged him on Facebook, and sent him Snapchats to wish him a happy birthday. He did not respond all day, and his family became worried because it was out of character for him. His aunt began posting on Facebook on his birthday and asked if anyone had seen him. She also stated that one of his sisters went to the home he was staying at in Fraggle Rock near Pine Ridge. A lady there said that Andre had left with his brother Marco on Sunday, October 16th. Andre and his brother had the same father but different mothers. Andre's mom belonged to the Gibbons family, and Marco's mother belonged to the Crow family. It was eventually learned that he was drinking with a few people in Oglala near tribal housing the night he was last seen. His family went to the same area on October 21st and began looking for him along the back row near the Crow residence where he was last known to be at. His Aunt Tony was a volunteer searcher for the tribe and helped Lynn file the missing persons report so they could get help from the tribe for searches, which began almost immediately after it was discovered he was missing. The tribe was very helpful with the search and even granted admin leave for tribal employees to help search as time progressed. Everyone was trying desperately to locate his body before the harsh winter weather came to the region. The search party looked on foot, horseback, ATVs, and a rancher even flew his plane over the search area. Family, friends, and the rest of the search crew were growing exhausted, but they never gave up hope. His family started a Facebook page for him called Search for Andre Starr on October 23rd. After every search day, they posted that they would find him tomorrow. They promised Andre that they would never stop looking for him. And after 38 days of searching through the vast reservation, they discovered his remains on Wednesday, November 23, 2022. He was found a half hour after the search day began in an overgrown marshy area. The weeds were so high and thick that searchers were only visible by their bright vests. Andre's family are very grateful for all the help they had locating his remains, but they are struggling with the fact that the people who harmed him are still roaming free. No information has really been released by authorities or the family on the circumstances surrounding Andre's disappearance, cause of death, or if there are any suspects. His family hopes that by protecting these details, that when a person is identified as a suspect, they will get justice for Andre. In a very strange twist, Andre's brother Marco was also found dead. His obituary listed his date of death as October 20th, 2022, which was Andre's birthday and the same day his family discovered he was missing. I could not find Marco's cause of death or if he also died under suspicious circumstances. He had just returned home from the Marines in March 2022. He was buried at the Black Hills National Cemetery in Sturgis, South Dakota. Andre was laid to rest at the Messiah Episcopal Church Cemetery in Wounded Knee, South Dakota. His family will continue to fight for him until the person or persons responsible for his death are caught. Vincent Brewer III was better known as Vinny. He was 29 years old, an avid basketball player, and the father of 3. Sometime before his murder, Vinny got himself caught up in the drug game. He allegedly racked up a $10,000 debt over meth with a gang known as the Eastside Oldies, who were from Denver. On October 16, 2016, 3 members of this gang, named Francisco Villanueva, Adan Corona, and Estevan Becerra, drove from Denver to Rapid City, where they picked up a man named Miles Tuttle. A woman named Tiffany Garner also was picked up along the way and was believed to be the gang's main contact in South Dakota. Vinny's mom has stated that Vinny was friends with Tiffany at one time and that she is also from Pine Ridge. Adan Corona is also Lakota. After arriving in Rapid City, these guys drove to Pine Ridge to hunt Vinny down. When they arrived into town, they picked up and spoke to people to help find him. That day, Vinny was playing in a basketball tournament at the Siouan Big Crow Boys and Girls Club. He had posted on Facebook about playing in the tournament. There were several people and young children present at the center because of the tournament. The gang that was hunting Vinny pulled up to the center in 2 cars, and they were armed with 9mm handguns and assault rifles that included an SKS and AK-47. A couple of them were wearing bandanas over their faces. The gang jumped out of their cars and pointed their guns at the crowd outside. Vinny attempted to hide under one of the cars, but they pulled him out from underneath it and began to physically assault him. At the same time, Estevan Becerra was pointing his gun at people to make them stand back. Vinny understood that they were there to kill him and asked them not to do it there and to let the kids go back inside, which they allowed. The gang then attempted to kidnap Vinny by shoving him in the back seat of one of the cars. He escaped from the back seat, and that is when Francisco Villanueva and Adan Corona shot him 15 times with a 9mm and one of the assault rifles. For Vinny's execution-style murder, each person received a federal sentence. Francisco Villanueva, 2 consecutive life sentences. Adan Corona, 1 life sentence. Estevan Becerra, a 15-year sentence. Miles Tuttle, a 9-year sentence. and Tiffany Garner received a 15-year sentence. Vinny was laid to rest at St. Paul's Catholic Cemetery in Porcupine, South Dakota. Doris Brings Plenty barely has any public information about her. Oglala Sioux Tribe Victim Services says she has been missing since the summer of 1983, and that when she went missing, she left behind 2 sons and 3 daughters. It is known that she has 2 brothers named Waverly and Enoch. Enoch continues to advocate for Doris at MMIW events. Prior to going missing, she was in a relationship with a man named Richard Ghost Bear. They had a son together and he was named Richard Jr. There was a court summons put in the newspaper on October 19, 1983. It stated Doris and Richard were to appear for a custody hearing for their son. I could not find out if they ever showed up to the court date, and a social media search for Richard Jr. yielded no results. He could have been adopted and had his name changed. But what is known is that Richard Ghost Bear Sr. had a very violent arrest record. In one of the news articles, his address was listed as 405 La Crosse in Rapid City. This is near Roosevelt and Memorial Parks, which are popular hangouts for natives in Rapid City. A look on Google Maps shows the address as a vacant lot now. About a week before the court date summons was posted for their son, Richard was acquitted for the stabbing of a man named Vince Whiteface. He had violently attacked him and stabbed him 5 times while they were drinking on November 16, 1982. On the very same day the court summons was published in the newspaper, another article in the same newspaper said that Richard had stabbed a 32-year-old woman in the neck behind a liquor store. She had a 3-inch gash that was bleeding badly. The woman went to the liquor store for help and told people there that Richard had stabbed her. When police arrived, she changed her story and she told them that she was mugged by 4 men. This article does not list a name for the female, but it could have been Doris. She would have been around the same age as the woman stabbed. According to additional news articles, Richard went on to club a man in the head in May 1984, which required the man to have to get 18 stitches. In 1992, he was arrested for burglary, and in December 2005, he was arrested for raping a 37-year-old woman. He was 51 years old at the time. It is unknown if he was ever questioned about Doris's disappearance, and if he did know anything, he took it to his grave. He died on November 5, 2021, at the age of 67. The son he had with Doris was not listed in his obituary. If you have any information about Doris or are a family member, please contact Janet Franson with Lost and Missing in Indian Country. She would like to get Doris listed in NamUs and needs contact with a family member to do so. Getting Doris into NamUs is an important step that needs to be done. If DNA from family can be obtained and uploaded, law enforcement could then compare the DNA to any Jane Does out there. It could also help find a match for Doris's niece, Lori Lee, jealous of him. She has been missing since 1989. I featured her case in episode 41. Both of them might be a Jane Doe somewhere. Morning Star Standing Bear was a 22-year-old mother of 2 daughters and was living in Rapid City. She had just turned 22 on Sunday, June 13, 1999. That following Tuesday, on June 15, 1999, she spent time with her mother and family in Deadwood, South Dakota. Her mother went on to say that Morningstar was an alcoholic and that she had just got out of a treatment center a few months prior. Later that day, Morningstar wanted to go out and celebrate her birthday with her friends. She called her mother that night from Dee Dee's bar. Her mom was watching her kids that night, so she was probably checking in on them. Her mom asked her to come home and she did not want to because she had been drinking. That same night, 4 other people showed up to the same bar. Don Frazier and Chasky White, who were in a relationship together, and Jerry and Robert Horse. Robert was 15 and had just moved to Rapid City from the Pine Ridge Reservation to stay with his brother Jerry. Chasky White was the leader of a gang known as Real Thug Family. When Robert moved to Rapid City, he met Chasky and Dawn through his brother Jerry. He soon began hanging out with the gang while drinking and doing drugs. At the bar that night, the group of four ran into Morningstar. They departed the bar and went to another friend's house to continue drinking. Morningstar passed out at the house. The group left the house party with Morningstar and dropped Jerry off at home. It was now the early morning hours of June 16th. Dawn drove the rest of the group in the car north of Rapid City and stopped the car on a rural back road. When Dawn parked the car, Chasky and Robert began to beat Morningstar and stripped her of her clothing. She was also beaten with tools from the trunk of the car. Robert would later state that he had kicked Morningstar so hard that his foot was still sore 2 days after. After these two guys brutally beat Morningstar, they stabbed her with a broken beer bottle and slashed her throat. She was then dragged and dumped into a ditch. After the murder, Dawn drove back to Rapid City and went to work as scheduled. After Dawn got off work on June 17th, the trio were questioned by police. Dawn would later admit that on the car ride there, that Chasky and Robert were planning on doing something to Morningstar and that she thought they were going to rape her. Dawn would say that she tried stopping the attack at least 4 times. Chasky testified that Dawn had stayed in the car while the murder took place. Both statements cannot be truthful. Dawn would also say that she was afraid of Chasky because he had raped her numerous times before. At the trial, the prosecution would portray Dawn as a willing participant in the murder. They claimed she was jealous of Morningstar and loyal to Chasky's gang. They also said that the murder happened 200 yards from a farmhouse and she did not go there for help. They also produced a letter written by Dawn from jail to Chasky, who was also in jail. This letter was relayed through an outside third party. She called Chasky her crazy love. She was not acting like she was afraid of him at all. The couple had been dating for only 5 months when all this happened. The punishment for the murder of Morningstar Standenbear is as follows. Chasky White pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and received life without parole. Dawn Frazier also received life without parole. Robert Horse had originally received a life sentence, but this was overturned and sent to juvenile court. He would receive a 40-year sentence. He was paroled after serving 19 years and was released on February 4th, 2019. In an article upon his release, he stated that he wanted to help single women, whatever that means. Morningstar's family will forever miss her. Alejandro Vasquez was 24 years old when he was last seen on October 29, 2015. His nickname is Alex, and he might also use the last name Gay. According to a couple different Facebook pages for missing persons, Alex was staying with his brother in a trailer near American Horse Creek, about 7 miles southwest of Kyle. He came up from Dodge City, Kansas to visit family on the Pine Ridge Reservation. Alex's brother last seen him at 3 a.m. on October 29th when he left the trailer. Neighbors say they saw Alex the next day knocking on his brother's door, but nobody answered his knocks. Perhaps nobody was home or they were still sleeping. Alex's dad said that he liked to drink a lot. It was also reported that he did not have a cell phone or debit card. Family and authorities have conducted several searches for him around the Kyle area, and so far they have been unsuccessful. His family set up a Facebook page for him called Searching for Alex Vasquez. They have some screenshots on there from a man with the last name Whitelance, and he claimed to dispose of Alex in a dump. Alex had shoulder-length hair at the time he went missing. He was last known to be wearing a black or gray t-shirt, black or plaid shorts, and white sneakers. He is 5'7" and about 200 pounds. Someone out there knows what happened to Alex. Please get the courage to speak up. Susan Fast Eagle was 30 years old when she went missing on May 3, 2021. Susan is married to a man named Thomas Chief Eagle, and she also may use his last name. Susan had just recently got out of treatment before she went missing. Susan lived in Red Shirt Table with Tommy and his family. They also have a daughter together. Everyone interviewed about Susan said she was a very kind, funny, gentle, and soft-spoken person. Lissa Yellowbird is a well-known civilian investigator and searcher within the Native community. She is also the founder of Sanish Scouts, a search group from North Dakota who searches for missing people of all race groups. Lisa had interviewed Tommy and helped search for Susan in Rapid City and on the reservation. Being an independent investigator gives her the power to search on and off Indian reservations. This is something that normal law enforcement cannot do because of jurisdictional boundaries. Tommy told Lissa that the day he last seen Susan on May 3rd, they were at Memorial Park. He said they had been drinking the night before and were feeling a little hungover when they woke up. He left Susan at the park to go get some chips, sandwiches, and Sprite. When he came back to the park, he could not find Susan. He also said that Susan liked to feed the ducks at Memorial and Roosevelt parks, so I can imagine he looked for her along Rapid Creek near the park. An official missing persons report was filed for Susan on May 13th. When law enforcement officials began looking into Susan's disappearance, they discovered that she was last seen with a man named Verdell Brownbull. He also was from the Pine Ridge Reservation and is from Kyle. It was also revealed that Susan had contact with law enforcement on May 3rd near Memorial Park. This statement did not say whether Verdell was with her or not. People who know Verdell also say that he is a very nice and kind person. His nickname is Bird. Verdell's disappearance also has conflicting dates on when he was last seen. Some posters state March or April of 2021. I am not sure how investigators determined he was with Susan. My best guess is that there is surveillance footage of them, or he was with her when she encountered the police. When Lissa was investigating this case, there were claims that Tommy abused Susan. These claims turned out to be false rumors that were being told over and over. Tommy's mother, Susan Shockey, loved Susan like her own daughter. She has since passed away. But in the early stages of the investigation, she said that tribal law enforcement officials had searched her property with four-wheelers and drones. They also walked around and searched an old house on the property. Nothing was found, and she said it was just a process of elimination. There has been absolutely no trace of Susan or Verdell. Neither had the resources to simply pick up and leave the area. Susan also would not just abandon her family. Being homeless could also leave both individuals in a vulnerable state. I recently done a video of a Winnipeg serial killer who targeted homeless women. There also has been reports from Arizona and New Mexico where people claiming to be from treatment centers will pick up people off the street and exploit them for state-funded treatment. I also did see a post that said Susan would often hitchhike from Hermosa, South Dakota to Red Shirt Table. If you have any information on Susan or Verdell, please contact the Rapid City Police Department. Sandra Wounded Foot was 15 years old and from Porcupine. She went missing on August 14, 1976, and was last seen with a BIA police officer named Paul Herman. I could not find out why he approached her or if he even arrested her. But a rancher discovered her body in a pasture 5 miles northwest of Porcupine on August 16th, 2 days after she was last seen. She had been raped and murdered, and it is believed she had died several days earlier. The case was immediately turned over to the FBI when it was discovered that BIA police officer Herman was likely the person who killed Sandra. He was relieved of police duties and given a desk job. BIA Administrative Manager Wayne Atkinson said that he was not discharged because no charges were filed on paper. He went on to say that he had an excellent service record and was admired by his co-workers. Paul's clerical duties continued until the tribe took over the law enforcement on the reservation in April 1977. He was then reinstated as a BIA police officer near Phoenix. There seemed to be little or no investigation. Then 2 years after the exact date Sandra's body was found, on August 16, 1978, a federal grand jury indicted him for first-degree murder. The indictment claimed that he committed this murder with premeditation during a rape or attempted rape. He was arrested on August 24, 1978, in Fort McDowell, Arizona. He accepted a plea deal and pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter on December 19, 1978. He was eventually sentenced to only 10 years in prison. Sandra is gone but not forgotten. Todd Littlebull was 25 years old when he was murdered in the late hours of August 1st, 2016, or the early morning hours of August 2nd, 2016. He played basketball, was described as respectful and active in his community and in spiritual ceremonies. Right before his death, Todd was making accusations against a well-respected medicine man and his organization. Todd claimed that the medicine man was a false prophet and that he was being used to trick people into thinking the medicine man's powers was real in spiritual ceremonies. Todd said that he was being threatened after he told the medicine man he was not going to help him trick people into thinking he had spiritual powers. He posted many screenshots on Facebook of the threats he was receiving, and the last one was posted at 11:36 p.m. on August 1st, 2016. The following is an account of what happened to Todd according to the two men charged and convicted in his murder. It is important to note that the medicine man and his organization have never been connected to Todd's murder. But it is also important to highlight that Todd is not here to contest the details that were accepted into court during the murder trial. A man named Stetson Eagle Elk said that Todd had asked him to come see him and Kyle on the night of August 1st, 2016. Supposedly, Todd told Stetson of a plan to have himself killed to cast suspicion on the medicine man and having his fraud exposed during the investigation. Another man also showed up that night named Gary Littlebull. He is also Todd's cousin. Gary said he heard of Todd's plan to have himself killed and agreed to help. The three men took off in Stetson's car. Stetson was driving, Todd was in the passenger seat, and Gary was in the back seat. According to Stetson and Gary, they drove down the highway and Stetson pulled on the emergency brake to create drag marks. They stopped and Todd rolled down his passenger seat window so gunshot powder residue would not get on Stetson as he fired from the driver's seat. Gary said he just stood by and watched this go down. When a passerby came down the road, they were told to go call the police because other unknown people had shot and killed Todd. When the police arrived, Stetson and Gary told them that two trucks had boxed them in along the highway and forced them to stop. And then one of the guys got out and shot Todd. Gary claimed that he was asleep until the car stopped. This was their attempt to cover up their murder of Todd by claiming that other unknown people had shot and killed him. After police found out that this was not true, the account of Todd asking to be murdered to expose the medicine man came out. Stetson and Gary were charged January 12th and 13th of 2022. For their roles in Todd's murder, Stetson Eagle Elk and Gary Littlebull both received 18 years in federal prison. This case has caused a lot of dispute amongst the Native community on the reservation. Todd's family was left in a state of shock and disbelief, even more so because his own cousin helped aid in his murder. The medicine man's followers were angry over Todd's accusations that he was a fraud. And the crazy thing is that Todd was born on August 2nd, 1990, meaning that he was more than likely killed on his birthday in the early morning hours of August 2nd, 2016. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And if you knew any of these victims, please share any memories of them. And I will see you in my next video.